Welcome to this video on everything you need to know about playing competitively at Magic events. Whether you only play casually at home with friends, only attend pre-release events every few months, exclusively play at home on Moto or Arena, or you've only played at the local game store level at FNMs and weeklies, this video will cover everything you need to know. Disclaimer that this video isn't going to cover specifically strategy and winning, although there will be some information about that. Rather, this video is more focused on things like logistics, mindset, rules knowledge, and best practices. There are three main levels of competitive play. The first is the casual or FNM level. These are going to be your once-a-week events at a local game store, including Friday Night Magic. Then there's your competitive events. These are things like regional qualifiers and 1K or 2K cash events. And finally, there's the bigger events like actual regionals, Grand Prix, and so on. Here are the supplies and accessories you'll need. First, a playmat. Normal table surfaces are too slippy and slidey. A playmat gives you proper grip so that cards don't drift from the lightest touch. A playmat also protects your cards from any dirty or grimy surfaces like from dust, water droplets, crumbs, etc. You'll want a deck box for your deck. It should be big enough to hold 75 cards, 60 for the main and 15 for the sideboard, or 95 if you're playing with Yorion. Extra space and compartments for holding tokens, dice, and so forth are a bonus. You may also want a divider to separate your main deck from the sideboard. Next, you'll want dice to keep track of +1 counters, Planeswalker loyalty, to roll for who's on the play, and so on. Extra sleeves in case any of yours become damaged from splitting, bending, etc. I personally recommend Dragon Shields, #not-sponsored, although they're not the only quality brand, they're the ones I've had the best experience with. As an example, I have thousands of Dragon Shield sleeves that I've been using for years and only had 3 split in that entire time. You'll want tokens to represent anything that makes them, treasures, clues, creature tokens, etc. These will preferably be the official Magic tokens, but they're not strictly necessary. They can be anything provided they reasonably represent what they're supposed to and can be shown to be tapped. You'll want something to track life totals. This can be dice or your phone, but preferably you want something that can be written on like pen and paper or a boogie board. And lastly, as many top 8 pins as possible to show off. Let's move on to your collection. Keep things organized. This traditionally means alphabetically sorted or sorted by color, but anything is fine so long as you know where everything is. You don't want everything in random piles, random binders, and random deck boxes. For example, here's my collection. There's a box of staples that I regularly use in decks, alphabetically sorted and by color. Then a binder that houses various rares or other valuable cards that aren't staples necessarily but are worth keeping around, sorted by color. And finally, some 5K boxes in my closet for numerous commons and uncommons, also alphabetically sorted. Everything is uniformly sleeved in black matte Dragon Shield, so I don't have to waste time sleeving or unsleeving cards. Unfortunately, even same brand sleeves can differ enough from one printing to another to not be uniform. Here's an example, and I don't know how well this will come across on camera, but these two sleeves are actually noticeably different shades of black. It can also be hard to tell depending on lighting. For example, at home in natural sunlight or under regular bulbs, these sleeves appear the same, but under the fluorescent lights at my LGS, they're different. So, how do you actually find a store to play at? You can go online and use the Wizard's event locator to find them. Go to the event locator, punch in your address and distance you're willing to travel, then the map will populate game stores near you. You can use the sidebar on the left to find out more information about events, but they may be out of date, so go to the store's website, Facebook page, or call them to find out what days and times they run their events. Generally, stores are going to run events throughout the week in the evening between 6 and 7 p.m. For Friday Night Magic, stores are given promos to hand out. These used to be literal promos, but are now usually randomized 4-card packs containing an arena code and 3 other cards, usually 1 uncommon and 2 rares from the standard card pool. Promo packs are limited and stores can hand them out however they want, so you may get them based on your record, for example, going X1 or better. Make sure to get the Companion app. It's an app that makes finding your seating more convenient. Register an account and log in. Every event you play at will have a code that you can punch in. You'll then get notifications when a round starts showing you what table you're sitting at and who your opponent is. If the store has monitors displaying the pairings, you can also use that, for example, if the app isn't working for some reason. If there's any confusion about where you're supposed to be seated, verify your opponent's name so you know you're playing the right person. You can use the app to drop from the event if you want to leave for any reason, for example, because you've lost multiple times and are no longer in contention for any prizes. The Companion app can also be used for other things like tracking life totals and looking up Oracle text. These type of events at your local game store are generally going to be more relaxed with a more casual atmosphere, and you'll see more brews, fringe decks, and people testing out different things. That said, every store differs. For example, my local game store has multiple Pro Tour level players and is very competitive. The formats at the store are going to be determined by majority player preference. For example, if a local game store has most players that prefer to play Modern, then they're probably going to run Modern events. That said, they do run events throughout the week, and so they'll generally divvy up which formats are played on which day. If you plan to play Limited, that is draft or sealed, make sure to bring empty sleeves and your own lands, although stores usually have a land station for the basic lands. Typical entry fees for events are somewhere around $5 to $10, or maybe $15 for a 3-pack draft, and somewhere between $20 and $30 for 6-pack sealed. Some stores allow using credit for entry, meaning you can free roll events similar to Moto and Arena if you're good enough to reimburse your entry fee. A typical prize structure will be some amount of store credit or booster packs based on attendance and the entry fees, with pricing based on placement or record, for example going X0, X1, or X2. There are various methods to decide who's on the play. Rolling odd or even, and this is the best one, more on that later. Rolling high or low. Rolling odd, even, or high-low using 3 or more dice. Doing poker rolls, meaning you use the best poker hand as represented by the dice, for example 2 of a kind, 3 of a kind, and so on. Using rock, paper, scissors using the unglued cards of the same name. Now, the reason odd or even is best is because it's the least mentally taxing, meaning you don't have to count up or calculate anything, and it doesn't require rerolls. For example, if you're rolling high to low, it means both players have to roll the dice, and if you tie, you have to roll again, whereas odd even is one player rolling the dice once, and then that's it. That said, if your opponent suggests a different method, just agree. Don't waste time arguing. You should pretty much always choose to go first, since the tempo gain from being on the play with an extra land drop is almost always better than the one extra card from being on the draw. There are exceptions, for example extremely slow sealed formats, but they're so rare that they're usually not worth discussing. For mulligans, the player who's on the play has to announce whether they're going to mulligan before the player on the draws does. So with all that said, that pretty much wraps up what you need to know at the casual or F&M level. So let's move on to the more competitive events such as regional qualifiers. Once again, you can use the event locator to find where and when RCQs are taking place. And once again, always verify that the information is correct by going to the store's website, messaging them on Facebook, or calling them. Anyways, the competitive level events are generally going to be your regional qualifiers, but they can also be things like 1K or 2K cash events. RCQs take place over seasons of roughly 3 to 4 month blocks, and they generally take place on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday. The main things differentiating these events from your casual or F&M level ones are that they're played at competitive rules enforcement level, which basically means that they're stricter and that you get penalties if you violate the rules. Also, if you queue during a season, you cannot play in any more events during that season. Typical entry fees for an RCQ are somewhere around $25 to $40 or $50 to $60 if it's sealed. The typical price structure will differ from your casual and F&M level events by being much more top heavy, and pay down generally to only the top 8 or top 16 if there's enough attendance. First place gets the invite, or second place as well if the store is a premium store. You'll get an entry promo and a top 8 or top 16 promo. For example, this season's promos are Unholy Heat for attending and Eldritch Evolution for making the top 8 or top 16. Pricing typically takes the form of store credit, but it can also be cash, packs, or even staples. So what is good pricing? Well, it's typically at or near 100% of the entry fees paid back into the pool as credit, or the converted equivalent amount in packs or staples for their market value. It can also be in cash as well, but it'll obviously be less. If, when you're looking at an event, they don't list any pricing, confirm that there actually is pricing if that's important to you. WotC has no prize requirements, and some stores will offer nothing in pricing, although this is rare, but it does happen. In terms of actually signing up, use the store's website, message them on Facebook, call them, or in some cases, email. Make sure to sign up early. Events can and will cap, especially the ones with a lower player space. For example, they can only seat 32. Day of entry is sometimes more expensive, for example, $5 more to incentivize registering earlier. Signing up early ensures you have a spot as well. Don't drive an hour to an event that you're not sure you can actually play in. And additionally, entry promos can be limited and they may only be given out in order of signups, for example, the first 32 players to register. Make sure to leave promptly. Check your route and leave with enough time to get there, and importantly, enough time to park. Parking is often limited. You may need to park far away and walk to the store, which can add 15 minutes to your travel time. That said, I've almost never seen an MTG event start on time, and they're regularly delayed by 10 to 15 minutes because gamers aren't punctual. Stores don't want to lose out on an entry fee by turning away players, and if enough of them show up, they'll regularly delay the tournament. If you're going to be late, call the store to let them know. They can probably delay the start time as long as you're not too tardy. And this is another reason to have your deck list written out ahead of time, more on that later. Because the entry fee and prizes are larger and players are traveling further away than normal than their local game store, for example up to an hour or more, expect to see more meta decks and better players. It's important sometimes to scout which players are playing what decks. Your opening hand and mulligan decisions can be very important depending on the format and the matchup. Try to get up and look around in between your matches and see which players are on what decks. Players are seeded by whatever bracket they're in, so for example, the players with the best records are going to be seated at tables 1, 2, 3, 4, and players with worse records are going to be seated at tables 16, 17, 20, 30, etc. Furthermore, the more of these events you attend, the more you'll see the same players showing up to each one, and you can get to know which players are playing what decks. These more competitive events are also going to have penalties with fixes, warnings, and game losses. Optimally, you should play perfectly, but no one does, and you are going to make mistakes, so the most important thing to remember is to avoid doing anything that would get you a game loss. The first, most obvious, and easily avoided one are deck and deck list problems. Competitive level events require that you have a deck list, and judges may check random players throughout the event at the start of rounds, or only the top 8 players. You can write out your deck list by hand or using an online resource like decklist.org or exporting it to decklist.org via Moxfield. Decklist.org or equivalent online resources are helpful for having everything nicely printed instead of handwritten, and these will generally also check that your deck is legal. For example, it contains the right number of cards, doesn't contain more than 4 copies of non-basics, all the cards are legal, etc. It'll give you warning messages if any information is missing, although the only information you actually need is that your first and last name are written and that everything else is legal. If you do decide to handwrite your deck list, make sure to double check that everything is correct. You should also check to make sure that the actual deck that you have matches the list that you're submitting. Just because your list is correct doesn't mean you didn't forget to bring some cards along or played the wrong cards. You should verify that your main board and sideboard are correct either before or after each matchup, especially if you're using cards that move things from the sideboard to the main, like Karn the Great Creator or Companions. Make sure that your sleeves aren't translucent, especially if you're using double-faced cards without using checklist cards. I tend to find that the lighter and warmer colors are worse for this, like yellows, oranges, and reds. If the event is a limited event, draft and sealed, these are going to operate a little bit differently than what you're used to at either pre-releases or drafts at your local game store. Players open their packs in front of one another and verify each other's pools. You'll generally have 20 minutes to register the pool and then 30 minutes to build the deck. The deck is then locked in, you can't change it in between matches. For bigger events, they may give you your pool already registered, in which case you just have to build it. If you open abnormal product, you should get it replaced. For example, you open a pack and all 15 of the cards are rares. You still get to keep the cards, but you can't use them in your deck. The store should just replace that pack with another one. In terms of differences when drafting from how you draft casually, the draft will be on a timer with the judge instructing you when to pick and pass your packs, and you can't look at your picks until the pack is completely finished. For team tournaments where you have yourself and 2 teammates, 2 out of the 3 of your team has to win their matches in order to win the match entirely. In unified events, card overlap is not allowed. So for example, if you and your teammates are all playing Modern, one of you is on Blue-White Control and one of you is on Hammer Time, only one of you can play Hallowed Fountain. At the start of the tournament, you'll have either a player meeting or you'll simply go directly into round 1 with the judge and the store making their opening announcements. If it's a player meeting, you'll all be sat down and then the judge will make their announcements and come around and collect deck lists, whereas if you're just seated for round 1, you'll go directly into your game after the opening announcements and handing in the deck list. As an aside, if you're a tournament organizer, please don't do player meetings. They're just a waste of everyone's time. The opening announcements from the judge will usually contain the following information: the number of players and rounds that the tournament's going to be, the tardiness policy, and other policy reminders. For the number of players and rounds, the rounds will equal the number of players and multiples of 8. So 8 players is 3 rounds, 9 to 16 is 4, 17 to 32 is 5 rounds, 33 to 64 is 6 rounds, and 65 plus is 7 rounds. You can sometimes have 8 rounds, but those are particularly big events. Tardiness is typically 0 and 10, meaning you should be in your seat when the round starts, and you may be given a one-time 1-minute late warning. Really, there's no excuse for being late, and if you're going to be because, for example, you need to use the bathroom or you left early before the round was finished to go get food, just let the judge know. And finally, the judge will usually finish with a reminder to check your deck to make sure everything is written and correct, although, again, you should have your deck list already printed out ahead of time and not need to check this. Judge calls. If anything goes wrong in a match, like the rules were violated or there's some discrepancy in information, make sure to call a judge. There's often only one judge handling calls for a tournament with 32 or more players in it, so the judge may need to take multiple calls at the same time. If you call a judge and there's going to be a delay, make sure to record the time so that you get the proper extension when they do come and answer the call. If you're worried about giving information to your opponent based on whatever question you're asking, you can ask the question away from the table. Know the rules. You don't need to read hundreds of pages of rules and policy documents, but you should know common rules and issues that frequently come up. Judges are just people like everyone else, and they make mistakes. You also can and will get judges who simply don't know what they're talking about. If the event has multiple judges, there will be a head judge whom you can appeal to if another judge gives you a bad ruling, but you should be able to argue your position with the proper rules knowledge. In terms of cutting your opponent's deck to randomize it before playing, you can simply cut their deck in half. Some players will take this a step further and actually shuffle their opponent's deck, but I generally don't find that this is necessary. So next, let's go over some rules that players commonly get wrong or don't know, especially when transitioning from more casual levels to competitive levels. The thing that I see players most often getting wrong is missed triggers. There is no difference between triggers that contain may or not, no difference between optional and mandatory triggers. You are responsible for remembering your triggers, and if you miss them, you miss them. There are also invisible triggers, which are basically triggers that don't have a visible effect on the game state. For example, prowess would be an invisible trigger. You don't have to announce it at the time, you only have to announce it at the first point that it's relevant. Additionally, sagas are not triggers. Their abilities are triggers, but moving the counter up is not a trigger, and you do have to remind your opponent to do it. Don't have any extra cards in your deck box. Your deck box should only have the cards that are in your main and your sideboard. Anything else is considered a deck error and will result in you getting a game loss. There are exceptions. For example, tokens are not cards, and you can store the promo that you get at the tournament in your deck box, but in general, just don't have any extra cards in the box. The cleanup step is another place where players often get things wrong. The cleanup step is the last thing that happens in a player's turn, and if you have excess cards, that is more than 7, and you discard them, that's the last thing that happens. Players cannot wait to see what you discard and then take actions afterwards. Be clear about what you're doing. Announce all life total changes. This keeps both players aware of what the life totals are, what they're changing to, and allows you to fix any discrepancy that happens immediately. If there's a discrepancy later on, you should be able to backtrack using your notes and figure out where the discrepancy happened and why. This is yet another reason why pen and paper or boogie board are necessary as opposed to something like a die. If all else fails, you may need to get the judge to come over and help figure it out. Although this is rare, if you still can't figure out why there's a discrepancy, the judge will defer to the player who has better notes, which is yet another reason why you want to have good notes and not just use a die. If you need to represent floating mana, you always need to have it written down. Sometimes it's okay to use dice if you're only going to have 1 or 2 extra floating, but in an example like a storm deck where you need to have lots of floating mana that's going to change frequently, everything needs to be written down. There's a difference between public, hidden, and derived information. Public information is information that's available to all players, such as how many cards are in your hand, what permanents are on the board, and so on. Hidden information is things like what specific cards are in your hand, what's in your deck, etc. Then there's derived information, which is basically information that is not immediately apparent, but which you figure out using public information. So an example would be that Tarmogoyf's stats are derived information. So let's say you're in a scenario where you control Tarmogoyf. You attack your opponent and they ask you how big Tarmogoyf is. Don't tell them to figure it out, just answer the question. If you don't tell them, they're just going to check anyway, and that wastes more time. Outside assistance. You cannot use any sort of information beyond the scope of the game you're playing, such as notes, online resources, or another player's advice. That said, there are exceptions. You can take notes during your game and refer to them in between games. You can bring a sideboard guide. There's no exact definition of how big your sideboard guide can be, but the general rule of thumb is that it shouldn't be more than 1 standard sheet of paper front to back. You can use your phone to do certain things like look up oracle text, but your opponent must always be able to see what you're doing on your phone. Regarding intervening in another match. If you're a spectator observing another match and you see something has gone wrong, the rules encourage you to pause the match and call a judge to fix it. However, my advice is that you should never do this. In terms of outside intervention, it is strictly negative EV for you to intervene. What if you're wrong? What if you say something you shouldn't? What if you're correcting the judge on a bad ruling and they go on an ego trip and punish you for it? There's no bonus to you for intervening and getting it right, but there are penalties if you get things wrong. So my advice is just keep your mouth shut and don't say anything. For team events, you can communicate with and advise your teammates, but you can't actually play the game for them. If you get up to leave during the match, for example to go to the bathroom, then you're not allowed to communicate with your team for the rest of the match since you may have acquired outside information. Understand how your deck works. Practice or watch primers. You should understand how your deck works so that you can play it in a reasonable amount of time and without making obvious mistakes. For example, there's nothing more miserable than watching a player who's new to Storm try to pilot it and stumble through their combo turn taking 15 minutes or more. Wins versus draws. A win awards 3 points, but a draw only awards 1 point. If you go to time, meaning you haven't finished your match when the 50-minute timer runs out, then you'll get 5 additional turns to finish the match, and if neither of you has finished it by then the game ends in an unintentional draw. If you're up a game, for example, you won the first game and then you drew in the second game, then you win the match. But if the score is even, you have 1 win, your opponent has 1 win, and it's game 3, then the game is a draw. There are times when playing to a draw is better, for example, in the case where you're up a game. You may also be in a position where there's no way you can win in the 5 remaining turns, but it is possible that you lose, so you'll take less risky routes in order to play to the draw. And as a note, there will be times when neither player can win in the turns remaining. For example, you're both playing aggro decks, both of you are at high life totals, and there's no possible way that either of you can deal enough damage in the time remaining. If this is the case, just agree with your opponent to end the game in a draw. Don't waste everyone's time by playing out a fruitless match. Next are the logistics of smaller events versus larger ones. This is generally going to be events that have a 32-player cap versus venues that have larger attendance. If possible, you want to attend events that have the lower attendance. This is for a number of reasons, but primarily because Magic is inherently a game of luck and variance determines a lot of matches. It's easier to win your first 3 games in a 5-round event and then draw into the top 8 versus winning your first 5 or 6 rounds in a larger event. The tournament will be broken into the Swiss rounds and then the top 8 cut. The optimal route for you to take is to win all of your early games and then be able to draw into the top 8. This is doable if there's a clean cut. So for example, if all of the players between 1st and 8th place are in a position such that even if they draw and only get 1 point, their point total is going to be higher than all of the players in 9th or lower, this is considered a clean cut, meaning all of the players in the top 8 can simply draw with each other and make the top 8 guaranteed. In other situations, this won't be as clear. For example, if players are not at a high enough point total that drawing will work, if players are paired down, if there were draws earlier in the tournament that mess the math up, and so on. Generally, the math works out that if you're undefeated, you can draw in with 2 or 1 round remaining, or if you have 1 loss later in the tournament, you can draw in provided it's either a clean cut or you're in the top 4. This is where tiebreakers matter. There are multiple tiebreakers, but the first and most important one is your opponent match win percentage, meaning basically that the better your opponents did, the better your tiebreakers are. And this is also why losing early is worse than losing later. When you lose early, you're necessarily being paired against opponents that have also lost, meaning their records are worse and therefore your tiebreakers will be worse. This is why you can, for example, win all of your matches until later on in the tournament, lose, and then still draw in, whereas if you lose early, you should probably just drop. In terms of dropping from the tournament, if you go 0-2 immediately, meaning you lost your first 2 rounds, then this usually means that you're no longer in contention for top 8 or any prizes, and you should just drop. You can, of course, still continue playing the tournament if you're just there to have fun and play the game, but players in your bracket are also going to drop, which means you may be paired against no one and not even get to play. Additionally, as of the recording of this video, the companion app will continue to notify you of rounds even if you've already dropped from the tournament. If you're not good with math and you're trying to figure out if you're capable of making the top 8 with your record or if you're capable of drawing into the top 8, there are online resources or apps that you can use. For example, I like to use Limited Info. You punch in the number of players and the number of rounds and it'll tell you what records will make the top 8. Although of course this isn't perfect since it doesn't take into account pair-ups and pair-downs or draws earlier. Once you're in the top 8, the game proceeds with the modified play-draw rule, which means rather than rolling to determine who's going first and second, the player with the better seeding at the end of the Swiss rounds chooses whether to play or draw. Now, in terms of whether you should play for seeding or draw in, it's overwhelmingly better to just draw in and not play for seeding. This is because if you play, in many circumstances, you may accidentally knock yourself out of the top 8 if you lose, or go way down in the seeding if you lose. How prize splitting works. Let's take this prize structure as an example. It's the top 8, and the prizes are 5th through 8th place get $50 in store credit, 3rd and 4th get $100, 2nd gets $200, and 1st gets $400. If nothing else happens, this is how the prizes are going to be distributed, but the players can agree to split the top 8 prizes into even amounts for all 8 players. In this scenario, this would mean that every player gets 125 in store credit regardless of how they wind up placing. The rules for this are that it must be unanimous. If even one player doesn't want to split, then no one is splitting. You also can't split anything that's non-splittable, for example, the invite or promo cards. I personally always elect to split since I think it's better to have a guaranteed prize rather than gambling on a better prize, and in my example, only the top 2 players are getting more than if everyone just splits. That being said, everyone has different opinions and to each their own. However, it's always fun to see the one player who didn't split get taken out early. Slow play. In terms of playing too slowly, most players will play at a reasonable pace. You'll also often have a situation where, for example, a complex and high-stakes situation means that a player plays slower than normal. This is natural since taking the time to calculate complex blocking against lethal damage will take more time than, for example, playing a land on turn 1. And if a player has been playing at a reasonable pace for the rest of the game, you can usually cut them some slack here. That being said, if a player is playing too slowly in general, you can ask them to speed up. If they still don't, you can call a judge over to watch them and ensure that they're playing at a reasonable pace. There are also certain decks that are just naturally going to take a lot longer to win the game. If you're playing a deck like Elementals, Blue-White Control, or Lantern, for example, then you'll need to play a lot more quickly than you would normally. Catching cheaters. First off, I want to stress that cheating is very rare and I wouldn't worry too much about it. For example, I've been playing the game for 13 years and I personally haven't ever caught anyone cheating, although I have been to multiple events in the past where Alex Bertoncini was present, including the one which led to him being permabanned, but that's another story. Usually, if a player is cheating, it's not obvious and requires putting together multiple suspicious things. Examples are things like all of the lands in their deck are foil and all of their non-lands are not foil, or vice versa. Most often the cheating occurs through something like a dexterity or sleight of hand trick. For example, a deck that frequently draws multiple cards or manipulates the positions of cards in the deck is easier to cheat with. Or a player does things like they frequently forget their own detrimental triggers. More often than not, what you get more so is players doing things like angle shooting and being sharky. For example, an opponent applies different standards to you than they do themselves. They take more time leisurely, but try to hurry you along during your turn. They try to strictly hold you to your decisions and actions, but ask for leniency themselves. Again, this isn't so much strictly cheating as it is being sharky or unsporting. Mindset and good sportsmanship. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's remember that the goal is to have fun. If maximizing value is all you care about, then you're better off playing a higher payout game like poker or just picking up an extra shift at your job. Magic events are generally bad expected value. Unless you're exceptionally good, you're probably not going to get as much out of the event as the cost of entering, travel time, and so on. This brings me to whether you should play a deck that's fun versus a deck that wins more. Of course, your deck does have to have some minimum threshold of power so that you can reasonably expect to win with it. But with that said, you don't only have to play the quote-unquote best decks in the metagame in order to win. And if I have the option between playing a deck that's fun or playing a deck that I think is 1% better, I'd rather pick the deck that's fun. For example, I'm your classic Timmy player that likes doing big bombastic things. I much prefer playing a deck like Elementals, but I've definitely brought my fair share of boring old Murktide to various modern events. And I can tell you that playing the Elementals deck is a lot more fun, at least for me. I think the best example of this is a thought that I had going through my head multiple times during these events, which is if you're losing, then you may as well have brought the deck that you were having fun with if you were going to lose anyway. Additionally, do take into account that some decks are more mentally fatiguing and slow to win than others. Once again, Elementals, Blue-White Control, and Lantern are going to be a lot more taxing and require you to play a lot more than a combo or aggro deck that wins quickly. Also, player sharkiness has diminishing returns and eventually becomes counterproductive. That is, if you're very strict, no nonsense, serious, and generally just not much fun to play and don't cut anyone slack, then your opponents aren't going to do the same for you and are not going to cut you any slack and play more seriously. You can win more if you do things like holding your opponents to their own missed triggers, failing to announce their companions, and so on, but this can only be taken so far, and if you take it too far, players are going to start holding things against you and you'll start losing more as a result. Basically, different players have different mindsets. Some are extremely lax, and others are more strict and will even hold themselves to their own mistakes or even unnecessarily point out your own missed triggers to make sure that you don't miss them. For example, one time I was at an event and unbeknownst to me, the sleeves I was using didn't all match. My opponent pointed this out, but they also said that they knew me and knew I wasn't trying to pull anything, so they'd let it slide as long as I switched the sleeves out after the match was over. If I'd been sullen, sulky, unfun to play with, and known as being a jerk in general, then they probably wouldn't have let that slide. And lastly, what I want to say about this is, if you won, don't offer the handshake. Losing is not fun. Some players get frustrated and may just need some time to decompress and wind down. And if you offer the handshake as the winner, it can feel like gloating. It feels pretty bad if you mulligan to 5 and get mono-screwed, and then your opponent reaches out and gives you a handshake as if it was some amazing great game. You might not see it that way, but others do, so just generally don't offer the handshake if you're the winner. It's on the loser to act with grace. Reducing costs. Playing Magic is expensive, especially if you're planning to drive out to faraway events many times over the course of multiple weeks and play in high entry fee competitive events. Carpooling is always a good option, but with that said, there's pros and cons to this. The pros are, of course, that you're spending less on gas money, and it's more fun to hang out with your buddies, being in it together, rooting them on when they win, and softening the blow when you lose. The cons are that you can't leave early if you lose, and depending on how early you lost and how well your buddies are doing, you may have to stay for multiple hours more than you'd otherwise want to. And of course, it adds extra travel time since you'll need to leave earlier and return later as everyone meets up, picks each other up, and drops each other off. So with all that said, let's move on to the bigger events. These are going to be your actual regionals, Grand Prix, and so on. Basically, everything that I said about the other competitive events that take place at your local game store are also going to apply to the bigger events. The big differences are just going to be the entry fees, what prizes are at stake, and the logistics of having so many more players at them. These events generally take place Friday through Sunday, with the main event starting Saturday and finishing Sunday. These events generally take place at a large venue like a convention center. There will be other activities there like side events, artists, and vendors, but generally the reason to go to these is the main event and everything else is just a bonus. I'd also like to stress that the side events at these venues are generally terrible EV with high entry fees and low payouts. These events are going to have multiple hundreds or thousands of players and be 15 rounds long, split over 2 days. They've been structured differently in the past, so I'll say that generally these events are 8 to 9 rounds on day 1, requiring you to either go X3 or X2 to advance to the second day, with the remaining rounds played on the second day. These events will have bigger and better prizes. You'll have a promo generally. For example, this RCQ season, the regional promo is Ugin. The pricing will vary, typically paying down to the top 64 or 128 players depending on how high the attendance was. You may have something like the top 32 or 48 players re-qualify for the next regional, meaning if you placed high enough, you don't have to grind the RCQ circuit again. And generally you'll have something like the top 8 players will queue for a bigger event like the Pro Tour, Worlds, etc. In terms of worthwhile prizing, you probably have to be in the top 32 or 16 players in order to reimburse all your expenses. An example might be that you have certain prize brackets for the top 32 or 64 players. For example, certain players will get 100, then the next bracket up will get 200, then 500, and so on. Between the entry fee, if there is one, the cost of gas or a plane ticket, and a hotel stay plus eating out, you're probably looking at having to be at least in the top 32 or 16 in order to get enough prizes back in order to reimburse all of your expenses. Costs, of course, vary, but I'd say generally you need to make around $400 in order to break even. In terms of preparation before these events, of course have much more investment put into them in terms of the cost, travel time, and so on, and are much higher stakes in terms of the prizes they can award. You generally want to start testing at least 3 to 4 weeks beforehand. It's great if you have an in-person group to test with, but if you don't, you can use Moto or Arena. Although I'd caution against using Arena since the developers have stated that it algorithmically smooths hands, meaning you get a better ratio of lands to spells. I believe they were talking specifically about Best of One, but I'm not sure if this also applies to other events. Some events may also be open decklist, meaning each player will be given a copy of their opponent's decklist before the first game and in between games when they're sideboarding. This heavily disincentivizes brews and special tech since the opponent will always know what you have. You should finalize what deck you're playing no later than 1 week beforehand, even if you're still making small tweaks and testing. Once you're at an event, you should have your deck locked in, but with that said, bring any extra cards you may want to swap last minute. Bring your own food and water. Unlike a local game store, the restaurants are too far away. It could take you as much as 15 minutes just to walk from the tournament hall to outside the convention center, much less to the restaurant, ordering and waiting and walking back. The convention center itself will have food in the hall, but it's overpriced since they know they can gouge you for convenience, and generally unhealthy since it tends to take the form of things like hot dogs, burgers, fries, and chips. Good examples of foods to bring are things that aren't too crumbly and not too perishable. Things like fruit bars, raisins, trail mix, pretzels, or plastic wrapped bagged sandwiches. Get enough sleep the night before. Don't stay up testing or goofing off. It absolutely sucks if you go to sleep at 2 a.m. only to have to wake up at 7 a.m. to get ready. In terms of reducing costs, the same thing applies here as to the other competitive events. Carpool if you can, especially since generally you're going to be using convention center parking, which can cost as much as $20. Split the costs of a hotel or an Airbnb, or if you don't have a group to stay with, you can find sometimes low rent housing like a hostel. Pack light. Try to fit everything into one travel case. This is going to be the general items you need for traveling, like 2 to 3 changes of clothes, toiletries such as toothbrush, toothpaste, and floss, a phone charger and the cords to go with it, and so on. Importantly, don't leave tasks unfinished before you depart. You want to be focused and not have nagging thoughts in the back of your mind of something you have to do when you get back. In the same vein, make your bed. Your future self will think your past self. Although it doesn't seem like it since you're mostly going to be sitting down in a convention center for most of the time, once you get back from your 3-day trip, you will be exhausted and you don't want to have to do anything, especially making your bed. Lastly, deferring events. It's possible that you could have something scheduled for the same time as an event that you're qualified for. For example, you're getting married or your wife is going to be 9 months pregnant at the time. You can contact WotC to try to get your qualification deferred to the next event, but it's ultimately up to them and they can deny you. So with all that said, I think I've covered pretty much everything you need to know. That concludes the video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to my supporters, and of course, if you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel. And take care.